Leaving Cert History students, this is part 4 of our look at US economic history, and we're going to focus now on the declining economy. We're going to start off by looking at the global effects on the US economy. The booming economy of the 50s and 60s started to slow by the late 60s. The cost of the war in Vietnam led to massive inflation. Johnson believed the US economy could support the war in Vietnam and his Great Society. Quote, "I believe that we can continue the Great Society while we fight in Vietnam." Johnson, however, was wrong. Johnson reduced taxation while continuing the same level of government spending. This meant there was not enough government revenue to pay for government spending and created a budget deficit. The 1973 oil crisis quadrupled the price of oil, and the 1979 Iranian Revolution increased the cost of oil. Between 1981 to 83, this was the worst economic recession since the Great Depression. Nearly 4 million people had lost their jobs in back-to-back recessions of the early 80s. Alright, so a budget deficit refers to when the government spends more money than it receives. This deficit or shortfall must be paid from borrowing money. In the 1960s, there was a deficit of 1% of the gross domestic product. This means that the government owed 1% more than the money that they made. In the 1970s, this deficit grew to 2% of the gross domestic product, and by the 1980s, this had doubled again to 4%. The government didn't increase taxes to pay for this deficit, it borrowed money instead. This put more money into the economy and increased inflation. In the late 1960s, the US economy went into a recession. 1969 saw rising unemployment, and in the early 1970s, prices rose by 6%. Labor costs rose due to wage increases. By 1971, there were 7 million people unemployed. Following the 1973 oil crisis, unemployment was at 8.5%. Rising unemployment and rising prices, called inflation, led to stagflation. US gold reserves fell to a third of what they had been in the 1940s. And by the 1960s, the US was importing more than what she was exporting. So let's have a little look at how the government responded to all of this. In 1971, President Nixon put a 3-month freeze on wages. He devalued the dollar so that the US exports were cheaper to buy abroad, but this made US imports more costly as a result. Nixon put tariffs on import to Japanese cars to try and promote the US car industry instead. President Ford declared inflation public enemy number 1. Ford cut government spending, which led to further unemployment. Carter increased government spending, which increased inflation. By 1980, inflation was at 13% and interest rates were at 20%. Carter rationed petrol following the Iranian Revolution. Reagan introduced his program for economic recovery. This saw him cut taxes by 25% to encourage more people to find jobs. He also cut spending on 300 government programs. By 1984, the economy grew by 10%. Unemployment fell to 7% and inflation dropped to 4%. Reagan cut spending on domestic programs and increased spending on defense. This created a huge federal deficit of $212.3 billion by 1985. In 1985, Congress passed the Gramm-Rudman Act to gradually reduce the federal deficit. International competition was another damaging factor to the US economy. International competition from Western Europe and Japan worsened the US economy. Between 1966 to 87, the US economy grew by 3.3%, while the Japanese economy grew by 6.5%, and the West German economy grew by 13%. Between 1960 to 73, Japanese workers were 3 times more productive than US workers. West Germany became the most economically successful country in Europe. This was aided in part by Marshall Plan. Between 1966 to 87, West Germany became the world's leading export country. It exported 30% of its manufactured goods. Japan exported 11%, the US exported 7%. West Germany spent less on consumer goods and paid its workers less than the United States. The US share of world trade declined from 25% in 1948 to 15% in 1964 to 10% in 1970. The EEC, the European Economic Community, replaced the United States as the largest trading bloc. Japan replaced the United States as the fastest growing economy. US imports rose from 6% in the 1960s to 16% in the 1970s. The United States seemed to be going through a process of deindustrialization, so the decline of manufacturing. But as the economy was so big to begin with, the US did remain the largest economy in the world.